The 20th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China has concluded its third plenary session in Beijing. The meeting adopted a resolution on further deepening reform comprehensively and advancing Chinese modernization. And joining me on this special edition of the program to unpack some of the key outcomes of the meeting and how they may affect Africa are from Beijing, Aina Tangen, Senior Fellow at the Tai Ho Institute and Chairman of Asia Narratives. And with me in Nairobi, Adere Cavins, China-Africa expert and international relations scholar, and James Shikwati, founder and director of the Inter-Region Economic Network and an expert in development economics. Also joining us here today are students from the University of Nairobi. Thank you very much for being a part of this discussion. Well, Aina Tangen, let me come to you first. The whole world has been following the third plenary session of the 20th Central Committee of the Communist Party of China. Explain to us what this meeting is about and why it matters to the world.
In terms of things that are actually substantive, China's meeting is very important. The third plenum is one of 7 plenums that are held each 5-year cycle of the election and 5-year plan. And it's generally the one where they set economic priorities. This was true in 1979 when Deng Xiaoping started his reform and opening up movement. And it was certainly true in 2013 when Xi Jinping announced, he put forward a very ambitious agenda, 60 items in total, that were really there to shape how the next 5-year plan was going to be put together. Now, remember, this plenum is really the kind of ideological base that will be part of shaping the next 5-year plan that begins in 2027. So these things are extremely important. You'll note that a lot of it was philosophical. They talked about the direction of the country, the issues that are facing it. The first sentence was about the turmoil of facing the world and how they had to deal with both domestic and international issues. I'm sure we'll get into those. So very, very important in terms of shaping how China develops. China is 30% of the world's growth. And then on top of that, it has 140 primary trade relationships with countries around the world. You may remember, at the 10-year anniversary of the Belt and Road Initiative, there are 152 countries who came, an acknowledgement that despite a lot of criticism from the West, that the Belt and Road Initiative is very, very important.
So, Cavins, I want to come to you here. Why does this matter for Africa?
Well, as the panelist has rightfully pointed out, China is now one of the most important anchors of global economy, contributing over 30% growth in 2023 compared to the US's 11%. Now, China is also Africa's largest trade partner since 2009 and becoming a very important source of foreign direct investment. In terms of peace and security ecosystem in Africa, China is the largest contributor of UN peacekeeping forces, as well as the second largest contributor in terms of that UN peacekeeping budget. So we see China as a source of very strong technology, opening up markets for African produce, opening its institutions for African young people from Africa. And so the primary role of China in terms of anchoring Africa's growth, but also the world's growth, cannot be overemphasized. And I think this is why this meeting is quite critical, because it is setting the pace for political, economic, and cultural conversations, both within China and outside China. And outside China also means here in Africa.
James, I want to come to you on that communique because it was issued at the end of the meeting. And delegates there were unanimous and they acknowledged that the world is facing a very grave and complex environment that threatens, the economic advancement and stability of the entire globe. What is your assessment of the current global economic and political situation?
Well, the current global turmoil, if I may put it that way, is best captured in the fact that countries are facing increased debt, increased poverty, income levels are going down, and you can see across the world, including Kenya, people feeling very much agitated and going to the streets. We've seen in Bangladesh. And I think the outcome of this meeting in China pointed to something very important about reordering the market. And if I speak from the African context, you'll notice that when you talk about debt, in Africa, it's dominated in the US dollar currency. So there's a challenge of having a debt that is in foreign countries' currency. Then when we look at the market system, how it works, it entirely does not favor Africa. For example, if you look at the financing system, it finances what the Western markets perceive to be of value, right, but it does not finance what, for example, Africans will perceive to be of value. So China saying that they are keen to reorder the market. I think this is an area that Africans should pay keen attention to and see how best probably they can jointly work with China, maybe through BRICS, to look at possibilities of how the reordering can be of benefit to the African producers and African industries as well.
And Tange, let me come to you here. How is China navigating this rather complex global political and economic scene?
Well, internationally, they're certainly, they've been forced to deal with embargoes by the US, especially in technology, attacks against their companies, whether it's Huawei or TikTok. Basically, any Chinese champion that emerges, especially if it has anything to do with technology, has been blacklisted. So there's that. The US sees China as an existential threat because it uses a different system and it's been successful. We certainly wouldn't be talking about China right now if it was not successful. So that gives you a clear idea. And this has happened once before in terms of Japan during the 70s and 80s, when all the things being said about China today were said about Japan then. Eventually, Japan acquiesced to signing the Plaza Accords in 1985-86. And to give you some measure of what happened to Japan's economy today is worth less in real dollar terms than it was in 1986 when it signed the Plaza Accords. Right. Internally, China is doing what they feel they must. They've adopted a strategy which they call dual circulation. And what this primarily relies on is consumption within the Chinese market with the largest middle class, and then attracting investment because there is such a large market.
So I'm going to take some questions from the floor. Let me start off with you here at the front. Questions to the audience, from the audience.
My name is Vanessa Kerubo from the University of Nairobi, and my question goes to you, Mr. Tangen. With the upcoming United States elections and the China's shift to green energy, how does it affect the African continent, especially when it comes into terms economic dynamics, geopolitical and environmental dynamics?
Aina Tangen?
Yes, well, I mean, you'll recall that in 2020, the Western powers, dominant powers, were supposed to deliver $100 billion a year to developing countries, including many countries in Africa, to help them deal with the climate change and the pollution that was originally caused, of course, by the developing nations when they were in their industrial period. That money has been very slow to materialize. It's estimated only 10% has actually been put forward. And of that, much of the money went in sweetheart deals to entities actually from the developed countries. So that has not worked out. China, on the other hand, has been pioneering in terms of green development. Their solar cells are cheaper or more efficient than anything offered by anyone else on Earth. Their wind power equipment is absolutely competitive. It's the best and most cost efficient out there. Also EVs, batteries, I can go on at quite some length, even with drones. So in terms of the green energy revolution, what China has to offer is a cheaper transition. The question is, where does the money come from to do that? I've long been a proponent that Africa consider BOTs, build, own, turn over, where you go to a company and the company says, look, if we build this, we want to make this amount of profit, but after that, we turn it back to the country, whether it's the government or another private entity, a joint partner. But the issue is that those assets then belong in the country. They're not rent-seeking opportunities by countries outside.
Okay.
Obviously, China can provide equipment, and they do have entrepreneurs who would be very interested in that.
Right, so we're going to take another question at the front here.
Good morning, distinguished panelists. My name is Stephen Nyaga from the University of Nairobi. I would like to direct my question to Mr. Shikwati. In the post-bipolar order, most African countries or states have struggled with the sovereign debt crisis and have not managed to rise above dependency as compared to their previously colonized counterparts in the global south. Is it a problem of resource management, economic models, or the loans borrowed from the international financial institutions, terms of conditionalities and terms? Thank you.
James.
Yep, I'd like to answer the question in the context of this resolution that just came out from China. You notice that the Chinese, in their resolution, are talking about exploring new models, new economic models, new market models. So that points to the fact that Africa is operating in a Western-led model, which has not been favorable to Africa. It's mostly extractive in its design. I already mentioned that even in its financing system favors what the Western countries define to be a product. So I would say that at the moment, Africa has to look at the possibility of the alternative model that is likely or is developing from the global south, especially if we utilize vehicles such as the BRICS to try and amplify the fact that African products can also be financially viable, and redefinition of risk. You notice that, again, it's the West defines what risk is, and therefore makes African borrowing extremely expensive compared to, let's say, how the Western countries borrow to grow their industries. So I think there's this possibility from the outcome of the Chinese document that Africa could say, let's build a global South voice and ensure that definition of risk is repurposed, the financial architecture is reorganized, and then how we position our products to the global market is driven by the global South voices, because at the moment we participate only 4% in global trade, which means the existing architecture has actually put Africa on a footnote instead of making Africa part of the active participant in the global market.
So that brings me now to Kavins, because going back to the meeting, the key words, deepening reforms, modernization, what do you hope to see in the short, in the midterm, in the long term, as the country forges ahead with this new transformation path?
Yeah, one thing is, which is for sure, is that China is very strategic in terms of its policy and decision making. So you're looking today at a plenum that is setting stage for policies that are going to be implemented from 2027. So that is a strategic vision, and they have a headroom to imagine government policy frameworks that can deliver their aspirations within that space. And so I think before 2027, when it really kicks off in earnest, what was discussed and concluded this week is that we're likely to see domestic policies that are essentially aimed at delivering the aspirations that's espoused in that communique that came out of that plenum. And you remember this is also happening at a point where China is increasing its global visibility and utility, right? So for example, in September, we're going to be seeing the staging of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. Mm-hmm. Now, African countries have an opportunity at this moment to understand the strategic position and directions that are being taken by China, to reorder their side of the story as well, so that when they meet the Chinese counterparts, they can come and have a balanced dialogue, a dialogue that can deliver prosperity for both sides. So we're likely to see additional initiatives from China. And by the way, China has become the most productive and prolific, in my view, country in terms of new ideas. Look at the Belt and Road Initiative, look at the Global Civilization Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative. All of these things are coming from Beijing. We hardly hear anything from the North except the Build Back Better America or Partnership for Infrastructure Development that has not delivered any value for Global South at all as we speak today. So I think as Chinese side puts their house in order, the African side must rise too and ask the difficult and strategic questions of how best to harness the potential of that cooperation ahead of 2027.
Right, I'm going to get some more questions from the floor. Yes, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Mabli Sara from the University of Nairobi. With China's plan on deepening its modern structures in Africa and refining its cooperations under the Belt and Road initiatives, my question to Mr. Adere will be, how can Africa leverage on this opportunity through the Africa Continental Free Trade?
Thank you. Now, Africa and China have, in my view, generated very durable outcomes under the Belt and Road Initiative cooperation framework. I think barely just about one country in Africa is not party to the Belt and Road Initiative. And that sends a message about popularity, but also utility, right? So China today is the biggest investor in Africa's infrastructure space. We're talking about road network, the rail, digital inclusivity and connectivity. So the internet connectivity in Africa, 60% of it has been built by the help of China in the last decade. You talk about green energy transition. China is now the biggest partner for Africa in that endeavor. And so I think there is opportunity within the 4 pillars of the Belt and Road Initiative, whether you're looking at infrastructure or trade or people-to-people connectivity or financial inclusion or political dialogue, as happens during these many frameworks that have been generated between China and Africa. So I think there is space. We need to see more infrastructure. We need to see more trade, because one of the biggest claims has been that Africa trades less with itself than with the rest of the world. And trade has been proven to be the most effective mechanism, one of the most effective mechanisms of poverty alleviation if you just increase it a little bit. So AfTA is, of course, anchored on that idea of increasing connectivity and trade. So China provides an opportunity, but also it's not just Africa getting everything from China, but I think it's a win-win scenario for China, because it offers their companies opportunity to internationalize when they come to implement projects in Africa. By opening Africa also gives opportunities to China, including in terms of tapping into the raw materials that are available in Africa to power its own industries. So there is an opportunity for win-win situation here, and I think the Belt and Road stands out as an enduring platform for the two sides to collaborate and register some development gains.
So I'm going to take another question. Go ahead.
Yes, my name is Felix Adwar from the University of Nairobi. Africa is still struggling with all technological vintage and technological dependency, which means Africa doesn't have control of most of the technological patents. My question is, how can African leaders, together with the Chinese investors and companies and partners, come together to ensure that there is technological transfer? Because in the model that we are operating in, and a Western model, there has been that lack of technological transfer. So how can China ensure that the industrialization in Africa get an uptake, or there is upskilling in Africa through this industrialization and also Belt and Road Initiative programs?
Right, James, I'll let you answer that question.
Yeah, I think it's a big challenge in the sense that in most cases when a country has invested heavily in developing their technology, they tend to hoard it, and that might not be different from China. But I think looking at the point that they are looking at a shared future, and they are rolling out platforms of engagement, I would say that Africa needs to be proactive, to take advantage of these platforms. And one of them being the Belt and Road Initiative, to the extent that whenever infrastructure projects are being done, African governments have to be proactive to ask that the skills transfer does happen among its population. And then we've seen the world is moving towards information communication technology, artificial intelligence. All these are areas where Africa can have a deliberate effort to request for strategic partnership with China so that they can build their capability, as opposed to simply being people who buy the technology. We should be part of the building of that technology. And I think in the information communication sector, it works best when you collaborate because it needs data. And Africa has over 1.3 billion people, and we could leverage on our population if we jointly craft a strategy to work with the Chinese.
Aine Tangen, clarify for us on that point a little bit better from China's position. Why are reforms still necessary in China?
It's a question of what kind of models work. I mean, this isn't from the Beijing government, I mean from Beijing, but I would say that, Africa together with other global South producers, not just in terms of manufacturing, I think in terms of the extractive industries especially. If they get together and they can form consortiums the same way that the oil nations did, they could be very powerful. And instead of begging for money that never comes, they could, in essence, price in the price of uranium or copper or whatever commodity is out there at a price that allows African nations to make their own decisions about taking care of global warming issues, also development issues. I firmly believe that Africa has to stand up for itself. It has to use the leverage that it has, and the political leverage is not there. We've seen that over how many years economically, as my colleague has pointed out. The whole situation is rigged against Africa because they say this is a risk, that is a risk, we won't lend to you. So I think while China can be helpful, it's in the end, it is going to be up to Africa to seize control along with other resource nations and say, look, we're going to have our own way of pricing our commodities that is in line with our interests.
All right. So I want to come to you, Kevin, because we've talked a little bit about the geopolitics, but I want us to look a little bit more deeper into the geopolitical situation, because in recent years, we've seen the United States and some other Western powers becoming more protectionist and more inward-looking. China remains committed to further opening up. How will China's opening up further affect the global economy?
Well, Chinese participation in the global economy is one of the most consequential economic activity of our modern times. And so the idea of reforming their own domestic ecosystem while increasingly opening up to the world is playing out. You're seeing, for example, last year, China continued with this upward trend in terms of attracting foreign direct investment into its own economy. At the same time, a stronger Chinese economy would allow Chinese multinationals to also go out and collaborate with the rest of the world. China has introduced new avenues through which it can actualize many tangible international collaborations, not just the Belt and Road. If you look at the situation in Kenya today, we have over 400 Chinese companies investing here, providing employment to over 40,000 Kenyans. Those spaces provides opportunity for skills transfer. Actually, Kenya today is a hub of rail technology thanks to the implementation of the standard gauge railway. We have young people who have now learned the skills and the ropes, and actually, as the country prepares for the handover of the operations of the SGR at the end of 2025, you see that young Kenyans are now more confident to manage every aspect of the rail technology. Africa is home to very many raw materials. Instead of us talking about exporting our products to China in raw form, why not attract Chinese industries, establish our bases here, refine our products, and then export them to China, which is now the largest consumer market in the world. So I think there is an opportunity. What Africans need to do is to be smart enough, be assertive enough in the global stage, and look for these creative ways to partner with international partners like China, which is not just willing, but has demonstrated its ability and commitment to commit capital into African infrastructure and many other investments.
Right. Dr. Mbuva, I'm going to take a comment from you. Go ahead.
The very moment there is an interaction between politics and in economics produces a rivalry or competition. And that automatically produces winners and losers. And some of the winners, I would say perhaps in Africa, are the consumers. We have a wide range of commodities, products in which we can be able to choose which also increases our, our quality in terms of what a consumer can consume. So my take is that as China opens, Africa also needs to understand in this competition, how are we going to handle? Because we are losing. How much are we exporting?
Right.
Very little. So thank you very much.
Okay, so I want to take your final winding up comments. And as you do that, also, I'd like to hear from both of you your key takeaways from the meeting.
Well, thanks. I think the meeting really sets the tone that China is willing and ready to engage the rest of the world. Africa, as a ready partner for China, really needs to reposition itself, reevaluate its strategy towards China, because I think that is one of the biggest challenges we have today. In most cases, China makes decisions with Africans at multilateral level, for example, at the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. But in terms of implementation, these decisions usually comes to bilateral levels. And every African country, therefore, must modernize its strategy towards China, make sure that it understands what China is, enhance its cultural competence, including language capability to effectively, engage with China. And so there is a sense that there is hope in terms of what the Chinese are promising to do, not just for their own market, but also for the rest of the market. That includes Africa. We look forward to seeing strategic engagements within the existing frameworks of collaboration, but even newer, more innovative, more sustainable models of collaboration that can deliver durable development for the Chinese and the African people.
Right, James?
Yeah, I think my biggest takeaway is how the Chinese are able to reflect deeply on their circumstance and develop a strategy towards the future. I think that's something that Africa needs to really think about, because in most cases we receive lectures on what we need to do and then just copy paste. So I think this internal reflection and then developing a strategy on how to engage is something that I think is my biggest takeaway. The second part is this opportunity to recalibrate the global economic model. I think this is very powerful aspect where even as scholars, researchers, governments in Africa is an opportunity for us to look at how best we can leverage on this. And for now, of course, we have the BRICS as a vehicle, but I think that's an area that we need to dive deeper, so that maybe by the time we are meeting for FOCAC, we should have some template that we could say the African view on a remodeled global market system.
Indeed, a very powerful message there. But that's all we have time for on this program. As China grows from strength to strength, we look forward to even more mutually beneficial cooperation with Africa. But that's all we have time for on this special edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guests, Aina Tangen, Senior Fellow at the Tai Ho Institute and Chairman of Asia Narratives, Derek Cubbins, China-Africa expert and international relations scholar, and James Shikwati, founder and director of the Inter-Region Economic Network and an expert in developmental economics. Also, I'd like to thank our members of the audience from the University of Nairobi. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and X, and you can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi, until next time, bye-bye.